So let's take a look now at Booleans in Zbrush. Booleans are, if you've encountered them in other programs, a method of subtracting or adding or manipulating one shape through the union, subtraction, or addition of another shape. It's basically like subtracting one shape from another. To illustrate this in the most simple terms, we'll go to the Tool, Subtool, or the Tool menu under Lightbox, and then open up a polysphere. I will take this polysphere and I'll go to Subtool and I will duplicate it. Now I'll take this duplicate and I'll just move it along the x-axis. Now here you see this subtool is set to normal mode. This one is also set to normal mode. However, if I take this and turn on subtract mode, it appears that nothing happens. However, if I turn on live Boolean, you see what that does is it Booleans out that shape. It Boolean subtracts that shape from the other. If I scale this sphere down, it continues to manipulate that shape. If I go into frame mode, you can see it's still there. It's just not visible as anything other than its Boolean component because it's subtracting from that mesh. So let's do this. Let's take this and duplicate it, bring it to the opposite side, and we'll set this to subtract as well. There we go. Now, I'm going to duplicate this again. I will rotate this 90 degrees, and let's place it in the center again, and let's scale it up to about there. Now, instead of subtracting, I'm going to use Boolean union, and look at that. Basically, it slices away everything that's sitting outside of the volume of that stretched sphere. So if I were to scale this in this direction, it would continue to slice. If I scale it in this direction, it would continue to slice. So you can use Booleans to very, very quickly create some really interesting shapes. Now, you'll notice that all of these are stacked up together in the subtool menu. There's a couple ways to bake your Booleans down. If I take the top subtool and click this down arrow, it creates a start group. If I click that start group, you see it's got 4 pieces inside of it. Now, with this start group created, if I go to Subtool, Boolean, and click Make Boolean Mesh, it will generate a U-mesh from that. And however many start groups I happen to have, it will generate a subtool for those start groups. So there I've got a piece of geometry that's been generated from that Boolean. This is no longer a Boolean. This is still the Boolean over here. If I turn off live Boolean, I can see all of my pieces. But here, this is an actual piece of geometry. So let's watch this in action. I'm going to go over to my polymesh star and let's go to the gizmo and turn this into a polysphere. There we go. And I am going to scale this in the z-axis and scale it in the x-axis. Now I'm going to go to my deformers and I'm going to select taper, and I'm going to taper this down to a point. I'm going to go back to my deformers and I will accept that deformation, and now I'm going to add another one. Let's do deformer. Let's grab these points here. I'm going to Control Shift, click and drag these points. Move those. Oops, go back there. I want to make sure I get all of those points and not just that point. So let's Control click on the background, Control click drag. There we go. Let's Control click drag over these points, Control click on the background to invert, and there we go. Now we can bring that point up. I'm creating a knife blade here. So I'm going to Control click and drag around these points. Let's Control click on the background and that selects them all. Control click and drag deselects them, Control click and drag, and then Control click to invert. So now I've got these, and this is sitting right on top of this gizmo here, so it's actually going to be a little hard to grab. There we go. Let's bring that up. I'm going to go back to my deformers and do taper, and I'm just going to widen the blade along here. And I'm going to go to flatten, and I'm going to flatten the top of the blade like this. There we go. So I'm just trying to create a nice sort of blade for a knife here. So let's turn off frame mode And I can divide this a couple times just to get a nice soft or nice smooth looking blade there. Now I want to create the crossbar for the handle. I think the easiest way to do this is just to append another polymesh star. Select that, go to the gizmo and turn this into a polycube. And then just scale it down. And then move that back where that crossbar needs to be. Just about there. Let's scale it in the Z-axis as well. Just like so. Maybe scale that like that. And let's go ahead and go to frame mode. And I'm going to go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and select the Z modeler brush. And let's go ahead and grab these faces here and these faces here. Just alt-clicking on these to select them. Now, if you have not yet seen the Z modeler video, I recommend checking it out. It's a very, very useful tool. While we're mousing over this polygon, I'll press the space bar and I'm going to QMesh, polygroup all, and I'm just going to grab these points and just pull them up. And then I'm going to go to scale, and I'll do polygroup all, and we'll do mesh center. Yeah, that should be, no, yeah, that should be good. Click and drag. Nope, I don't want mesh center. Let's undo that, and let's change that to polygon center. There we go. We can scale those down now. Now if I press Control D, I just get an interesting looking kind of crossbar there. We can subdivide that a couple times. And now I'm ready to create a handle. Actually, I think I might scale this up a little bit more. There we go. Now I will duplicate this subtool. I will go to Geometry and just delete my lower subdivision levels. That way I can turn this into a polygon cylinder, like this. I will click and drag along these axis controls to increase my resolution. And then I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees, bring it out here, and then let's scale it down the Z-axis. This is going to be the handle for our knife here. I'm going to alt-click on that crossbar and just widen that a little bit. Go back to our handle, and then we can just scale that down so it's sitting properly inside there. There we go. So we get a nice little stiletto here. Now I'm going to take that handle and squash it a little bit this way. And there we go. Maybe give it a little bit more length. There we are. Now I want to duplicate this subtool. I'm going to go to my gizmo again, and I'm going to turn this into a ring 3D. Now the ring 3D is pretty low resolution, so I'm going to increase my resolutions along each axis to smooth it out a bit. And increase my radius a bit. And then I'm going to scale this down so it's intersecting the handle. I'm going to bring that back to about here. Now, I want to duplicate these rings going all the way down the length of the handle. Now, before I do that, I want to add a material to this. So I'm going to go to my material options here, and I'm going to select, let's say, Matte Cap Gorilla. And I'm going to turn on the M modifier and go to Color, Fill Object. Now I'll just go back to my basic material 2, and that object now has that material assigned to it. I'll go to W for Move, and I will hold Control, and I will click and drag and duplicate that, then let go of Control, and I can keep dragging, and it will duplicate the same distance along that drag. Okay? All right, so now we're not going to use start groups here. We're going to use a more advanced way of organizing our Booleans. I'm going to select the handle. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this handle. That puts the handle inside the folder. I'm going to grab these rings, put them inside the folder, and I'm going to name this subtool Rings. Now I'm going to go to the handle itself, and I'm going to fill this with material. Let's fill this with, let's say, green metallic. Go to the material modifier and color fill object. Now we can switch back to our basic material 2, and the handle now has that metallic material. Now the reason I filled these two with materials is because I want to show you something interesting that happens. If I set this to Boolean subtract, the rings subtracting from the handle, watch what happens when I turn on Boolean. Those rings now subtract from the handle, and they also leave the imprint of their material. Now if I go to frame mode, you can see the rings are still there and they're not quite intersecting the entire handle. So I'm going to scale them in X. Make sure that we clear any masking on there. Control, click, and drag. And there we go. If we just scale them in X, we get this real nice knurled handle there that really feels like a good grip for this blade. So there we go. And it picks up both of those materials. So I will duplicate this subtool. After a point, I find it easier just to duplicate subtools and then turn them into new objects. So I've turned this into, the rings I've now turned into a polysphere, and I'm going to rename this pommel. And this will be the end point of the dagger here. I'm going to go ahead and scale this in X and in Y. And let's duplicate this a couple times. And let's create a new folder for this, call it pommel. Now I'm going to duplicate this object, put it inside that folder, and I am going to rotate it 90 degrees and scale it down, and then create a subtraction object. And this is going to subtract this shape from the pommel. There we go. Now I'd like to put another shape inside of there, so I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this tool. I will use the gizmo to turn this into, let's turn this into a cylinder 3D. And I've got multiple subdivisions on this, so I just need to go to geometry and delete my lower subdivision levels, and then turn this into a cylinder 3D. There we are. Now this has an option here that creates a tube, so I'm going to turn that up to create a tube, increase my resolution in both these axes, and let's rotate this, and let's scale this down, and let's scale it in X. So we get this shape sitting inside of that negative space. Now, if I take this and put it inside this folder, what'll happen is it'll disappear because it's being Boolean subtracted out of that. If I move it down here, it's not being Boolean subtracted because the Boolean's working its way up the list. So I can put it in the pommel folder, but it'll just have to be beneath any subtraction object. So let's do another subtool. I will duplicate this, and let's turn this into a polysphere. And let's turn our resolution on this down and create this little jewel shape here. And we'll scale this down so it's sitting inside of that. And then I'm going to go to my materials, and let's go ahead and put a reflect red on that. So I'll go to material, color, fill object, and then go back to my basic material too. So now I've got a little space in there that has a jewel sitting inside of it. So if I go back to my pommel subtraction object here and go to frame mode, we can see what's happening where we're getting this this subtraction space, or this subtraction object that's creating that negative space. Now perhaps I want to just make the space a little bit more complicated. I will duplicate this object, I will rotate it 90 degrees, let's bring it over here, scale it down, and then let's make that subtraction object again, turn off frame mode, and then I'm going to scale it along the x-axis here. So now we can get this nice sort of scallop shape. So this starts to almost look like an eye. Look at that. So that's much more interesting as a form. Let's go back to our scale and let's scale this like this. There we go. Move that up. Perfect. Now I want to duplicate this across to the other side. So I just go to Z plugin, Subtool Master, and I'm going to mirror across the x-axis and merge into one subtool. So that mirrors that across to the other axis. And oops, where'd it go? Oh, I got the wrong axis there. That's the problem. So I'm just going to undo that and go back to Z plugin, mirror, and I'm actually going to do the Z axis if I'm not mistaken. There we go. Now I'll turn off frame mode, and that's on both sides as you see here. So I'm going to take that jewel and place that inside the pommel folder and just collapse that folder. And I'll collapse the handle folder. So now we want to return to the blade. So let's come back up to the blade here. And if we want, we could probably go ahead and put that that handle inside of the, or that crossbar inside the handle folder, just by placing it here beneath the rings. And that'll give us a little bit of some variety there. While we're at it, let's go ahead and grab the handle and add a little bit of interest to this. I'm going to duplicate it, delete my lower subdivision levels, and let's turn this into a polysphere. Bring that up, scale it up, and scale it like this, and scale it like this. And then we'll make this a subtraction object. And then we can just add a little bit more interest to this handle, like this. There we go, that's quite nice. I'm going to divide this so the resulting shape is a little bit smoother. And once again, I will go to Z plugin, mirror, and remember that we're going across the Z axis. And there we go. So now we've just made that shape a little bit more interesting. We could do another here. Let's duplicate this subtool, delete lower, and let's change this into a polysphere again. Let's increase our resolution again so it's not quite so jewel-like. There we go. And we'll move this up. Let's move this back towards the crossbar here. Scale it down. And I just want to do a little scallop out of this shape here. So I'm going to make that a subtraction object and then just bring this down. Maybe scale it in like this, just so it makes a little bit of an interesting form there. And then I will go to Z plugin, mirror, and this time I will go along the Y axis. There we go. So now let's return to the blade, and I'm going to save my work at this point, just to be prudent. Okay, so with the blade selected, I'm going to duplicate the blade and delete lower subdivision levels so I can use my gizmo to turn this into another polysphere. I am going to scale the polysphere down, and then I'm going to extend it along the x-axis. And I want to create kind of a blood groove in the blade. And that's the sort of groove that you'll find down the length of some blades that I believe it's to allow blood to come out of the stabbed animal. Not a huge knife expert, but I believe that's the case. So let's go ahead and scale this down a little bit and make this subtraction. And then we can scooch this down to here and extend that, maybe bring it up to here, scale it down. And maybe we just want to bring it out so it's not quite so deep. And scale it in. Let's turn on frame mode so we can actually see what we're doing here. I'm going to squash that, turn off frame mode. Oops. And there we go. Now I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to go to Z plugin, mirror across the Z axis and click OK. And that'll place that on both sides now. Now I want to put a little scallop right here, little notch where the blade attaches into the handle. So I will duplicate this subtool and let's change this into a polycube. And we'll scale this polycube down, bring it down here, and then just make that a subtraction object. And that's just this little notch that you see often when you're a blade sockets into a handle. We'll do something along those lines there. And I will go ahead and duplicate this again, move this up here, make this a subtraction object. And I'm just going to scale it all the way along the length of the blade, and then I'm just going to use that to sort of make that flat along the top. I'm going to name this blade top flat. It's always very, very helpful to take the time to name your pieces. I'm going to rename this blade notch and rename this blade groove. There we are. And let's select the top item. Let's create a new folder called Blade. And then we will drag these objects inside of that folder. All right, so I would like to, I think, move the handle and the pommel together. So I'm going to close all my folders. I'm going to click on the handle group and I'm going to say transpose set. And everything that's inside the blade, oops, that was the blade folder. Let's undo that. Let's go to the handle and make it a transpose set. So now everything in the handle is in a transpose set. I can move them all together, but I want the pommel as well. So I click the gear and do transpose add, and that adds that to my transpose set. And I can just scooch that up a little bit, so it's closing the distance there between the blade and the handle. And then I can just Control Shift click and drag on the background or to invert my selection or turn off the pizza boxes so I'm no longer selecting multiple objects, the pizza box stack being there. It's the affectionate name Zbrush has for the transpose all selected subtools icon. So we can leave transpose mode now. Let's go to our blade and let's go ahead and fill this with a material. So I'll go to material and let's make this matte cap satin. No, let's not do matte cap satin. Matte cap shiny. Yeah, that's nice. So we'll do material, color, fill object. So now we've filled that with that material. And let's select another material here. Perhaps green metallic again for our crossbar. So let's go to color, fill object. And then we can switch back to basic material too. And here we go. So now we have created this knife using Booleans. If I turn off live Boolean, you're going to see all the different objects that we use to create it. Now I recommend, saving your work as a Boolean, but when you're ready to collapse it down, you can use start groups like we did before, but because we're using folders, there's a much, much, much better way of doing your Booleans. If I click on the gear for the blade, I have the option to Boolean folder. I also have the option to Boolean folder with dynamic subdivision levels. Now, if you're using dynamic subdivision levels, you want to make sure that those are calculated into your Boolean. If you don't know what those are, watch the video on ZModeler because we talk about that in ZModeler. It's a way of smoothing a mesh without having subdivision levels. So that's an interesting and important thing to know. But we're not using them here. So I'm going to click the gear on the blade and I'm going to click Boolean folder. And this is a fantastic operation. It hides the folder and then creates a new mesh that's Booleaned. There's my blade. You can see it's got all the Boolean shapes taken out of it. And I'll just rename this blade. Now I'll click the gear on the handle and I will click Boolean folder. It will hide the folder for the handle and then it will give me a Boolean version of that handle. And we'll rename this handle. And we will do the same for the pommel. Boolean folder. And there's our pommel. Let's actually move these to the bottom of the list. And it automatically turns off visibility on everything else there. So we're going to frame mode here and take a look at what we've got. It creates the best possible topology that it can. You will notice that sometimes you do end up losing material assignments. So here it has not picked up the material assignment on the handle quite as well as it could have. However, if I turn these off and stay with my Booleans, those materials pick up just fine. That's partially down to the resolution. If I were to take the handle and delete it, I'm just deleting the Boolean mesh version of the handle. I'm going to go back to my handle here and I'm going to go to the rings. I am going to add subdivision levels to the rings. I'm just adding 3 and I'm going to add 3 subdivision levels to the handle. Now I'm going to Boolean this group again. It'll take a little bit longer because that mesh is more dense, but giving it more geometry to work with can often help that material assignment stick. There we go. And there is our handle. So it's a little bit better, but we're still getting a little bit, go to the handle there. We're still getting a little bit of problem areas there. So let's try one more time. Let's delete this and let's go back to our handle. Let's open that folder and let's go to our rings, and let's turn off live Boolean, and I just want to take a look at our rings. I'm going to solo this. Those are fine. Let's go to our handle, and let's see if we can just increase our divisions on this. Go to our subtools, turn visibility back on this, and turn off solo. Turn live Boolean back on. And let's try this once again. Let's go ahead and Boolean this folder. And there you go. You see, as we start to increase our subdivision levels, that material assignment is more and more accurate. So if you're running into a problem where your material assignment isn't sticking once it's remeshing, it's just because it's remeshing it to such a low subdivision level. You just need to increase the divisions that you have on your Boolean pieces to make that work. Tell you what, we'll do it one more time. I'm just going to delete that handle again. This is the Boolean version. This is the collapsed version. We'll delete that, and we'll come back up here to the rings, and we have 4 subdivision levels on the rings. The rings are probably fine. I think it's just the handle at this point. We'll add one more to the rings, and we'll go to the handle, and we'll add one more to the handle. Now let's go back up here, turn visibility back on this folder, close the folder, and I will click the gear and Boolean folder. And this should be the most accurate of them all because we have increased our resolution on those 2 Boolean objects, so the resulting mesh will be a lot more accurate. Also, it takes a little bit longer to generate, as you can probably see. It's just a byproduct of having extra divisions in there for Zbrush to do the math on what resulting mesh it'll get when it subtracts this model from this model. It has more points to compare. Booleans are extremely powerful. It's my favorite method of creating hard surface props. I find myself using them quite often in my day-to-day work. If I have to do a prop or a costume element or any sort of little hard surface piece, I find Booleans in Zbrush to be really, really fun to do. They're also super accurate. I used to use Booleans in Maya years ago, and the Booleans were never really all that accurate. I'd always get problems in them that were pretty frustrating, so it wasn't something that I really used in my modeling toolkit. These I will use in my modeling toolkit because Zbrush not only does these accurate Booleans, but it also does fabulous remeshing. Remember, and if you have not yet watched our Z Remesher video, watch that video and note the changes that have been made in the Z Remesher program. We can turn on detect edges, and Z Remesher is much, much better now at remeshing hard surface objects than it ever has been in the past. So that's something to bear in mind as well, that once you've generated your Boolean, you're still absolutely free to go ahead and Z remesh it. Now here you can see that this is very, very accurate. Go to frame mode. It's a lot more dense. Oops, I'm still on the handle. There we go. It's much, much more accurate, but it's going to be more dense, but that's fine. It's not so dense that we can't actually manipulate it. The whole mesh right now is 2 million. Or is that? No, that mesh is not 2 million. Is it? Yeah, that's just about 2 million. Or just about 3. But it's giving us those material assignments. And that's really only necessary if you want those material assignments to stay crisp and accurate. If you're not using materials with your Booleans, you can get away using a lower subdivision level to generate them. So that completes our look at Booleans in Zbrush. I hope you found this helpful and you can see ways that you can utilize this in your own workflow. Remember that there are 2 ways to execute a Boolean. You can use start groups, but start groups really are not used all that much anymore. Nowadays, we just click the gear and Boolean the folder. Now there is something else that I should mention. If I delete these pieces here, I'm just going to delete these Boolean pieces, delete this one, and delete this one. If you want to just automate the entire process without having to click each one of those, if you don't want your Booleans to be within the same subtool stack, you can still come down to the Boolean menu here and click Make Boolean Mesh. And what that will do is it will go through and it will Boolean each one of your groups and make a new model up here. And each subtool is going to have its own, or each Boolean folder will have its own subtool. So I had visibility turned off on the handle. So let's do this again. Let's click Make Boolean Mesh. And what it'll do is it'll create a UMesh as a separate Z tool. And that Z tool will have 3 subtools because we have 3 folders. Whenever you execute Make Boolean Mesh, it will generate a subtool for each folder that you have. So anything inside that folder will be part of that subtool. And there we go. There's our UMesh with our 3 subtools based on each of those folders. So there you have it. That's Booleans in ZBrush. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.